In the autumn of 1969, on a gravel road outside of Vermilion, Alberta, a 38-year-old woman named Clara Whitfield paid $420 for a half-section of wetland that every grain farmer in Vermilion County had written off as worthless. The land was not worthless, but nobody in that part of Alberta in 1969 would have told her so. The parcel had belonged to a retired schoolteacher named Edmund Fray, who had bought it in 1951 with the idea of draining it and putting it into canola. Edmund had gotten as far as hiring a drainage contractor who had looked at the property for 2 hours and told him it would cost more to drain than the land would ever produce. Edmund had paid the assessment fee, driven home, and not gone back. When he died in the spring of 1969, his daughter, who lived in Edmonton and worked for a telephone company, listed the half-section through a real estate agent who had never sold wetland before and did not expect to start. Clara heard about the listing from her neighbor, a retired farmer named Gus Heller, who had heard about it from the agent himself during a haircut in town. The agent had mentioned it the way you mention a problem you cannot solve. Half-section of slough and muskeg south of Frog Lake Road. Nobody's going to touch it. Clara drove out to look at it on a Wednesday in October. She went alone. She parked her truck at the edge of the gravel and walked the property for 3 hours in rubber boots while the cattails bent in the wind off the North Saskatchewan. She called the agent that evening. "What does the daughter want for it?" he told her. Clara made an offer $200 below asking. The daughter, who had visited the land once and found it cold and full of mosquitoes, accepted by the end of the week. Her husband, a quiet grain farmer named Roy Whitfield, heard about the purchase when Clara came home with the signed papers and set them on the kitchen table. Roy was not an arguing man. He had been married to Clara for 14 years and had learned in that time that certain purchases did not require his opinion. He looked at the papers. He looked at her. He poured himself a second cup of coffee. "You bought Edmund Fray's swamp," he finally said. "Half of it," Clara said, "the south half." Roy nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he is trying to find the charitable interpretation of something. He was a practical person. He ran 1,200 acres of wheat and barley between Vermilion and Kitskote, and he had a farmer's reflex for calculating the productivity of land the moment he looked at it. Edmund Fray's south half-section produced nothing he could think of except reed-winged blackbirds and mud. "What are you going to do with it?" Clara picked up the papers and slid them into a folder. "I'll tell you when it's ready." Roy drank his coffee and said nothing more about it for 3 years. Let me tell you about Clara Whitfield, because what she did with that land over the next 2 decades makes no sense unless you understand who she was and where she had learned to see the things other people walked past. Clara was born in 1931 in a farmhouse outside of Lloydminster, Saskatchewan, the second of 4 children. Her father, Morris Whitfield, farmed a section of mixed land along the Battle River, the kind of land that was productive in wet years and punishing in dry ones, which in that part of Saskatchewan meant it was productive about half the time and punishing the rest. Morris was not a man who fought his land. He was a man who watched it. He kept a notebook in the breast pocket of every jacket he owned, and he wrote in it every morning before breakfast. The weather, the condition of the soil, what was growing where it had not grown the year before, what was dying where it had thrived. He told Clara when she was 9 years old that a farmer who did not write things down was a farmer who was going to keep making the same mistakes until he ran out of chances to make them. Morris Whitfield had an opinion about wetlands that was unusual in 1940s Saskatchewan. He believed they were doing something, not the farming, the land itself. He had a low spot on the northwest corner of his section, 3 acres of cattail marsh that flooded every spring and drew ducks from April to October. His neighbors told him to drain it. The county told him to drain it. The agricultural extension office, when he asked about it in 1947, sent him a pamphlet about tile drainage and the productive potential of reclaimed wetland. Morris read the pamphlet and put it in a drawer and left the marsh alone. His reasoning, which he explained to Clara when she was old enough to follow it, was simple. In dry years, his fields nearest the marsh yielded better than his fields on the far side of the section. The soil near the marsh held moisture differently, but it was a July. The runoff from the upland filled the marsh filtered it, and something in that process put water back into the soil in a way that the fields, far from it, did not benefit from. He had no scientific language for what he was observing. He had numbers in a notebook going back to 1932. The numbers said the marsh was doing work for the farm that nobody was giving it credit for. Clara had read her father's notebooks, all of them. She had read them the way some people read family letters, carefully, with attention to what was said between the lines. When Morris died in 1962, she took the notebooks with her and put them in a filing cabinet in the spare bedroom of the house she shared with Roy, and she added to them every year in her own handwriting, the same observations, the same attention to what the land was doing that nobody else was watching. She had also been reading, not the Alberta agricultural bulletins, which in 1969 were still recommending drainage as the primary management tool for wetland-affected farmland. She had been reading research from American universities, from Manitoba, from a small but persistent community of wildlife biologists and soil scientists who were beginning to document something that contradicted everything the drainage advocates were saying. Wetlands did not reduce a farm's productivity. They supported it. They recharged the groundwater that fed the wells. They filtered the runoff that would otherwise carry topsoil off the upland fields. They moderated the water table in ways that showed up, years later, in the yield data of the fields around them. In wet years, they absorbed the overflow that would otherwise drown a crop. In dry years, they released moisture back into the soil profile in ways that could not be replicated by any irrigation system a farmer in Alberta could afford. The agricultural establishment in 1969 did not believe this. Or rather, they believed it in the way people believe things that conflict with their economic interests, abstractly, theoretically, and not in any way that changed what they told farmers to do. Clara had been reading these papers since 1964. She had been thinking about Edmund Fray's South Half section since 1966, when Gus Heller had first mentioned that the old school teacher was not going to do anything with his slough ground. She had not bought it in 1966 because she did not yet have the money. She had saved for 3 years and made the offer the week after the listing appeared. That is why nobody in Vermilion County understood the purchase. They were watching a farm wife spend $420 on land that produced nothing. They were actually watching a woman execute a decision she had been building toward for 5 years on the basis of research that the rest of Alberta had not read and would not read for another decade. The story went around the way stories go around in farming country. Clara Whitfield bought Edmund Fray's swamp, paid good money for it too, going to do something with it, apparently. That last part always came out with a particular tone, the tone of a community waiting for a punchline. The punchline did not come. What Clara did in the first 2 years was almost nothing, and in farming country, almost nothing looks exactly like having made a mistake. She walked the property in all 4 seasons, She mapped the cattail stands and the open water areas. She noted where the water moved during spring runoff, and where it pooled, and where it drained slowly away. She took soil samples from the upland margins. She hired a wildlife biologist from the University of Alberta for 2 days in the spring of 1971 to identify what was living in the marsh. Not because she was sentimental about ducks, but because she had read enough to know that biological activity in a wet land was a proxy for the hydrological work it was doing. A dead marsh was a marsh that had lost its function. A living one was working. Roy watched all of this without comment. He was a fair man. He had seen Clara read for years without understanding entirely what she was reading, and he had come to understand that when Clara read something for a long time and then did something, the two things were connected in a way he would eventually be able to see. He was waiting to see it. Gus Heller was less patient. He was 64 years old, had farmed the same quarter section for 40 years, and held opinions about land use with the confidence of a man who had made a living from his and watched others fail at theirs. He came over for coffee one Friday in the spring of 1971 and asked Clara directly what she was planning to do with Edmund's slough. "I'm going to leave most of it alone," Clara said. Gus set down his cup. "Leave it alone. Leave the wetland. Manage the margins." Gus looked at Roy. Roy looked at his coffee. "The margins," Gus said. "The upland edge. There's about 40 acres of transitional ground between the slough and the surrounding farmland. I'm going to plant that to perennial grass and run it as a buffer." "A buffer," Gus said. "Between your swamp and what?" "Between the wetland and the cultivated fields around it. To slow the runoff. Keep the topsoil from moving. Let the water filter through before it reaches the marsh." Gus was quiet for a moment. He was trying to find the farming logic in what she was describing and not finding it. He was a practical man, and a decent one, but his practicality had been shaped by 40 years of agricultural advice that pointed in one direction. Productive land was drained land, and land you were not cropping was land you were wasting. "Clara," he said, "that's 40 acres you're taking out of production. That's 40 acres I'm putting into a different kind of production," Clara said. Gus drove home without finishing his coffee. He told his wife that Roy Whitfield's wife had lost her mind over that Fray property, and that somebody ought to say something before she spent more money on it. His wife told him to mind his own farm. Clara planted the buffer strip in the fall of 1971. She seeded it to native fescue and wheatgrass, species that her father's notebook had identified as the original ground cover of the Battle River uplands before the breaking plow. She did not put a crop on it. She did not graze it the first year. She let it establish. The neighbors noticed. The story updated itself. Clara Whitfield planted 40 acres of grass on Edmund Fray's swamp ground, and is not putting a crop on it. This version of the story had less patience in it than the original. 40 acres was real money in 1972. The summer of 1973 was wet. The North Saskatchewan ran high from May through July, and the low-lying fields in Vermilion County went underwater in June. 3 of Roy's neighbors lost portions of their barley crop to standing water. Roy lost nothing, partly because he had tiled his lowest fields in 1968, and partly because he noticed that summer his fields that bordered Clara's buffer strip drained faster than they had in the years before she planted it. He did not say anything to Clara about this. He wrote it down in his own notebook, which he had started keeping in 1971 without telling her, because he had decided that the most honest way to evaluate what she was doing was to document it himself. Clara documented the same thing. In the summer of 1973, In the summer of 1973, the wetland on the south half section absorbed 3 times its spring runoff volume without overflowing its margins. The buffer strip held the upland soil in place through 2 heavy rain events that stripped topsoil from every cultivated field within a kilometer of Frog Lake Road. She measured it with stakes and string. She wrote the numbers down. She did not tell anyone what she had found. She had learned from her father that a farmer who announces good results early invites skeptics to explain them away. And she had enough of her father in her to prefer her numbers to other people's opinions. In 1974, she approached the federal government's PFRA office in Edmonton about a conservation easement on the wetland. The PFRA, Prairie Farm Rehabilitation Administration, had programs for this, or was beginning to develop them, and Clara had been corresponding with a biologist there named Paul Ing Strupp for 2 years. The easement would formalize the wetlands protection, and, more practically, would come with a small annual payment that would offset the taxes on the land she was not cropping. The PFRA said yes. It took 14 months of paperwork. In March of 1976, Clara Whitfield became one of the first private landowners in central Alberta to sign a permanent conservation easement on a working wetland adjacent to active farmland. The payment was small. The neighbours found it puzzling. Roy told Gus Heller about it at the co-op, and Gus said that accepting government money for not farming your land was not something he would ever do. And Roy said he understood, and drove home and told Clara what Gus had said, and Clara nodded and went back to what she was reading. By 1977, there were 3 things happening on the Whitfield farm that Clara had not mentioned publicly, and that Roy had begun to see clearly enough to write about in his notebook. The fields adjacent to the buffer strip were yielding 4 to 6 bushels per acre better than comparable fields on the other side of the section. The soil in those fields, when he dug down in the fall, was darker and held together differently than it had in 1969. And in the drought, months of July and August, when the water table across most of Vermilion County dropped to the point where shallow wells were failing, the water table under the fields near the Fray wetland stayed 2 feet higher than it did anywhere else on their land. Roy had not expected any of this. He had not expected it because he had not read what Clara had read, and he had not read it because he had assumed, in the quiet way practical men assume things, that the Agricultural Extension Office would have told him if there was something worth knowing. He was beginning to understand that the Extension Office was telling him what they knew, and that what they knew was not everything. He said none of this to Clara directly. He was not a man who apologized for doubts he had kept to himself, but he started asking questions in the mornings over coffee, real questions, the kind that meant he was trying to understand something rather than test it. And Clara answered them the way her father would have answered them, with numbers first and explanations second. The summer of 1988 was the driest summer in Alberta since the 1930s. There was no other way to say it. The precipitation records for Vermilion County from May through August 1988 were the lowest since the Dust Bowl years. And everyone who was old enough to remember the Dust Bowl said so, and everyone who was not old enough said they understood now why their grandparents never talked about those years without going quiet afterward. The grain crops went in normally in May. They emerged thin in June. By early July, the topsoil across most of the county was cracked and pale, and the crops that had emerged were stunted and beginning to tiller poorly. In late July, the temperature sat above 32 degrees for 11 days in a row, but it was a dry July. The wind came out of the southwest, and stripped what little moisture remained from the surface soil. Farmers who had tile-drained their wetlands in the 1960s and early 1970s were watching their fields turn color in a way that meant the yields were already settled and the number was going to be bad. Clara's fields did not turn the same color. They were stressed. She would say later that she had no illusions about what the summer of 1988 was doing to her crops. But the fields adjacent to the buffer strip and the Fray wetland stayed green 2 weeks longer than the fields on the far side of the section. The water table under those fields, which Roy had been measuring at the monitoring well they had installed in 1975, was holding 1.5 feet higher than it had in the equivalent week in 1984, the previous dry summer. The wetland was discharging. It was moving water slowly back into the soil profile through the root systems of the buffer strips. Grasses, the way Clara had read it, would. The way her father's numbers had suggested it could. The way Paul Ingstrup at the PFRA had confirmed in papers she had been reading since 1973. Roy's barley in the east fields yielded 18 bushels per acre in 1988. The county average was 11. The fields directly adjacent to Clara's wetland buffer came in at 22. His neighbors, the ones who had drained their low spots in 1966 and 1971 and 1974, averaged 9 bushels. Some of them averaged less. One operation 2 kilometers up Frog Lake Road. A family that had farmed since 1921 and had drained every wet acre they owned by 1970 did not have a harvestable crop at all in the south portion of their land. Roy drove those roads in late August and did not talk about what he saw. He was not a man who celebrated at the expense of his neighbors' losses. He came home in the evening and sat at the kitchen table and was quiet for a while. And then he said, without preamble, that he owed her an explanation. Clara waited. "I should have read what you were reading," he said. "In 1969. I should have asked what you were looking at. You were busy with your own land. I was busy assuming someone would tell me if there was something worth knowing." Roy picked up his coffee cup and set it down. That was the error, not the busy part, the assuming. Clara nodded. She had known this for a long time. She had not needed him to say it, but she was glad he had. Gus Heller came over that September. He was 71 years old and had lost 30% of his barley crop to moisture stress. And he sat at Clara's kitchen table for 2 hours and asked her questions she had been ready to answer for 15 years. She answered them without satisfaction, without the particular tone of a person who has been waiting to say, "I told you so," because she had learned from her father that there was nothing useful in that tone and considerable damage in it. Gus asked the same question at the end that Roy had asked at the beginning. "What made you buy Edmund's swamp in the first place?" Clara thought about it. "I read a paper from a researcher in Manitoba in 1964 that said wetlands adjacent to cropland were increasing the productivity of that cropland. He had 20 years of yield data from farms in the Red River Valley. I thought if it worked in Manitoba, it probably worked in Alberta. And I knew my father had seen the same thing on his place outside Lloydminster without ever having a name for it." Gus was quiet for a moment. "Your father saw this. He kept notebooks. He just didn't know what he was looking at. But you did." "By 1964, Clara said. By 1964, I knew what he had been looking at for 30 years. Gus drove home. He did not drain the low spot on the northwest corner of his quarter section, the one the county had been after him about since 1975. He left it. He told his wife he was leaving it because of what Clara Whitfield's land had done in August, and his wife said she was glad someone had finally gotten through to him. And Gus said it had not been someone, it had been a drought, and his wife said that was usually how it worked. But it was a dry lie. The Alberta Conservation Workshop in Edmonton in the autumn of 1991. She was 59 years old. She had not spoken publicly about her land in 22 years of managing it. She almost declined. Roy told her she should go. She drove to Edmonton in October with a manila folder of yield records, water table measurements, and the rainfall data Roy had been compiling since 1975. She stood at the front of a meeting room in a Holiday Inn and spoke for 30 minutes, without notes, to an audience of about 60 people, mostly extension agents, some researchers, a handful of farmers. She said what she had learned in the same plain, sequential way her father had written things down. What the problem was, what the research had said, what she had done, what the numbers showed. She did not editorialize. She did not perform. At the end, a researcher from the University of Lethbridge asked her what she thought would have happened to her farm's productivity in 1988 if she had drained the Fray wetland in 1970, the way the Extension Office had been recommending at the time. Clara considered this. "I think Roy's east fields would have come in at 11 bushels with everyone else," she said. "I think the south fields would have been closer to 8. She paused. "I think we would have spent the next 3 years paying down an operating loan with yields that didn't cover our input costs. And I think we would have assumed it was the drought and not the drainage, because that is what everyone assumes, because the drainage happened 15 years earlier. And the drought happened yesterday, and people do not usually connect things that are that far apart in time." The room was quiet. She picked up her folder. "My father watched a 3-acre marsh on the northwest corner of his section for 30 years and never drained it, because the yields near it were better than the yields far from it. He had no science for it. He had a notebook. I had the science. It was the same observation, 20 years apart, 120 kilometers away. The land was saying the same thing. We just needed to be paying attention." She sat down. The wetland on the south half section outside Vermilion is still there. Clara handed the property to her son-in-law, a quiet man named Bernard Houle, in 1998, when she and Roy moved to a smaller house in town. Bernard had married their daughter, Penny, in 1987, and had helped Roy with the harvest every year since. He had grown up on a dairy farm near Bonnyville and had a farmer's instincts and a willingness to keep learning that Clara had recognized early and valued accordingly. Bernard runs the land today. The buffer strip is in its 53rd year. The fescue and wheatgrass that Clara seeded in the fall of 1971 have thickened into a permanent stand that has not been reseeded once. The wetland holds the same open water it held in 1969. The monitoring well Roy, installed in 1975, is still read every week from April through October. Bernard's daughter, who is 12, has started writing down the numbers herself. The conservation easement Clara signed in 1976 runs with the land in perpetuity. Whoever owns the property after Bernard will be bound by it. The wetland will not be drained. This was something Clara had insisted on when she signed the easement, and the PFRA biologist had told her she was being careful. And Clara had said she was being realistic about the difference between a person's intentions and the intentions of whoever comes after them. In 2004, Paul Ingstrup, by then retired from the PFRA and teaching part-time at the University of Alberta, wrote a paper on wetland retention and farm productivity in the prairie provinces. He cited 11 farms in his dataset. One of them, identified only as a mixed grain operation in central Alberta with 34 years of continuous monitoring data, had yield records for the fields adjacent to a retained wetland that were, he wrote, among the most consistent and well documented in the prairie literature. Clara read the paper in December of that year, sitting at the kitchen table in the house in town, with the same manila folder of yield records open beside her. Roy asked her what she was reading. "Something Paul Ingstrup wrote," she said. Roy poured himself coffee. "Good?" "Consistent," Clara said. She turned the page. "Consistent and well documented." Roy sat down. He looked out the kitchen window at the snow on the street. He thought about the East Fields in August of 1988, the green that had held 2 weeks longer than it had any right to. He thought about the number 18 written in his notebook beside the word barley and the year. "Your father would have understood it," he said. "He would have told me the buffer strip was too wide." Roy laughed. It was the laugh of a man who has been paying attention for a long time and is finally at peace with what he has seen. Some lessons come from books. Some come from notebooks kept by fathers who never had the words for what they were watching. Most of the time, the book and the notebook are saying the same thing. And the only difference is who was willing to read both of them before it was too late. Clara Whitfield paid $420 for a half section of slough and muskeg that every farmer in Vermilion County had written off. She planted a buffer strip on 40 acres of it and left the rest alone. She watched the water table. She measured the yields. She signed a paper that said the land could never be drained, not by her, not by anyone who came after her. And in the driest August, that part of Alberta had seen in 50 years, while her neighbours watched their crops go pale and their operating lines stretch thin, her east fields came in at 18 bushels, and her south fields came in at 22. And the wetland on the Fray property sat full and quiet behind the fescue grass, doing the work it had always been doing, the work nobody had given it credit for, until the summer it ran out of time to be ignored. I keep thinking about the moment Clara drove out to Edmund Fray's south half-section alone, in rubber boots, in October, while the cattails bent in the wind. Nobody asked her to go. Nobody sent her. She went because she had been reading something for 5 years that told her the land was worth looking at, and she trusted the reading more than she trusted the consensus. That is the part that stays with me. Not the drought. Not the yield numbers in August of 1988, though those numbers are remarkable. What stays with me is the 5 years of quiet preparation before anyone knew she was preparing for anything. The papers she read, the notebooks her father left her, the decision she made in a kitchen in Vermilion without announcing it to anyone, because she understood that announcing a conviction before you can demonstrate it only gives other people time to talk you out of it. There is something in that I think we misunderstand about people like Clara. We tend to look at the outcome, the east fields at 18 bushels, the neighbours at 9, the wetlands sitting full and quiet through the worst summer in 50 years, and we call it foresight, or luck, or stubbornness. What it actually was honesty. Clara was honest enough to read things that contradicted what everyone around her believed. She was honest enough to admit that the Extension Office might not know everything worth knowing. That is harder than it sounds. It requires a particular kind of integrity, the willingness to hold an unpopular conclusion long enough to test it, without the comfort of anyone else agreeing with you. Roy understood this eventually, and I think the moment he said, "I was busy assuming someone would tell me if there was something worth knowing," is one of the more honest things a person can say about themselves. Most of us live in that assumption. We assume the official version is the complete version. Clara's father had taught her otherwise, not by telling her the officials were wrong, but by keeping a notebook and letting the numbers speak for themselves over 30 years. She inherited that discipline before she inherited the notebooks. And then there is the long middle, the part nobody talks about when they talk about people who turned out to be right. 19 years between the purchase and the drought. 19 years of walking the property in every season, measuring the water table, watching the buffer strip establish itself, writing things down that no one else would read for a decade. That is not a romantic kind of endurance. It is the ordinary, unglamorous kind, the kind that does not look like courage while you are doing it, because it mostly looks like going out to check a monitoring well on a cold Tuesday in March when you would rather be inside. I think about Morris Whitfield watching his 3-acre marsh for 30 years without a name for what it was doing. I think about Clara, finding the name in a Manitoba research paper in 1964 and recognizing her father's numbers in someone else's data. That is what it looks like when one generation's patient observation becomes the next generation's understanding. The knowledge does not appear from nowhere. It accumulates, slowly, in notebooks, in yield records, in the careful attention of people who decided that what the land was doing was worth writing down. The swamp nobody wanted is still there. Bernard's daughter is 12 years old and already reading the water table numbers herself. That is how it continues.